You didn't burn the bridge. You simply turned the light on. And in that flicker of brutal clarity, every mask cracked, every illusion fractured. You didn't have to accuse them. You didn't need to rant or scream or drag them into the fire. You just stared, with eyes that had finally learned to see. And in that silence, they unraveled. Because when you stop needing someone to be better than they are, you start noticing exactly who they've always been. The game was never fair, but you kept playing, hoping effort would beat manipulation. Now, you don't play, you observe. And observation, when backed by detachment, is lethal. You saw the threads, the mechanics, the cruel joy behind every misunderstanding. And when the performance ended, all you had to do was step back. That's when the haunting began. Because once the truth is seen, it can't be unseen. What destroys the manipulator isn't the fallout. It's the mirror. The realization that their carefully crafted persona failed. That the version of them they projected into the world was pierced by your gaze and dismantled without violence. They played the hero, the victim, the misunderstood soul, just trying to connect. But you saw the rot beneath the poetry, the hunger for control masked as love, the passive aggression dressed as humor. And once you saw it, they lost their grip, because their whole identity hinged on your belief in the lie. They needed your loyalty to fuel the illusion. Once you stepped out of that role, they were left alone with what they truly are. And that, more than any revenge, more than any confrontation, is what haunts them. Being seen, truly seen, without flattery, without fear, without the lens of your empathy to soften their reflection. You gave them the gift of authenticity, and they mistook it for a weakness. You held space for their broken parts, assuming they wanted to heal. But they didn't want healing. They wanted performance. They wanted an audience. They wanted someone to believe in the pain, not so they could change, but so they could remain. You didn't just walk away. You exposed their choice to remain stagnant. You shattered the myth that they were trying. And nothing cuts deeper than exposure without cruelty. Because they can't paint you as vengeful. They can't call you bitter. All you did was stop pretending. You stopped applauding the act. And in that stillness, they met themselves. Without your hope to cover the stench. Without your forgiveness to delay the consequences. They stood in the wreckage of their own design. There's something savage about the quiet clarity you gave them. They don't hate you because you left. They hate you because you understood. You saw through every script, every sorry that was really a reset button, every apology that came with strings. You spotted the patterns they worked so hard to normalize. And then you held up the mirror, calmly, firmly, without blinking. That's where the pain lives now. Not in your absence, but in your insight. You didn't unlove them. You outgrew the illusion of who they were. And that evolution shames them in ways they can't articulate, because they can't hide behind ignorance anymore. You gave them understanding, and understanding demands accountability. They saw themselves through your eyes, raw, exposed, unfiltered. And now every other gaze feels dishonest. Every other connection feels shallow, because they know what it felt like to be seen, and still failed the test. Your healing is the loudest sound in their silence. Every step you take away from them echoes like thunder through the hollow corridors of their ego. They scroll, they watch, they wonder. Not because they may miss you, but because you carry something they lost the moment they tried to control it. Integrity, truth, a refusal to dilute yourself to soothe their fear. You became the consequence they never accounted for. Not an explosion, not a curse, but a ghost. One that speaks only through memory. One that doesn't beg to be understood, but exists as proof that they were never what they claimed to be. That's what haunts them. Not your rage, but your peace. Not your words, but your withdrawal. You stopped arguing. You stopped convincing. You just walked away with the truth still burning in your eyes. They will try to rebuild, of course. Try to find someone else to project their edited self onto. But it won't work, because the act is tainted now. Every new connection is a reminder of the one they lost. Every lie tastes sour in their mouth, because now they know what it feels like to be known, and still rejected. That kind of rejection doesn't fade. It festers. It creeps into every performance they put on. Every time they try to wear a mask, they remember how easily you tore it away. That's the scar. Not the loss of you, but the loss of the illusion that they could forever hide. You made hiding impossible. Your understanding became the curse. They'll smile, they'll laugh, they'll pretend they're fine. But inside, they're wading through the wreckage of their own exposure. They'll say you changed, that you were too sensitive, too intense. But those words are how the shallow describe depth. They'll rewrite the story, because in their version, they need to be the misunderstood protagonist. But deep down, when the world goes quiet and no one's clapping, they'll hear it. Your silence, your truth, the realization that someone once knew them completely and still walked away, that someone once held up a mirror and didn't flinch. You made the invisible visible, and that visibility now follows them. It sits in their relationships. It haunts their solitude. They want to control. What they got was clarity. And clarity, once tasted, poisons every lie they try to believe again. You're not bitter. You're clean, washed of illusion, purged of their poison. And that's what they never expected. They thought you'd stay tangled, thought you'd spiral without their validation. But you didn't just survive. You transformed. You became sharper, wiser, more dangerous. Not because you hate them, but because you finally love yourself enough to never be fooled again. You became the standard they'll never live up to, the mirror that doesn't lie. And whether they admit it or not, they measure themselves against you now. Every time they try to rebuild, they compare the weight of shallow approval to the depth of your honesty. And nothing measures up. Nothing tastes as real. Being seen for who you are is liberating. Being seen for what you pretend to be is terrifying. There's a distinct kind of peace that comes from being seen in your rawest form. No masks, no curated angles, just the full, unfiltered complexity of your inner world. The rage and the restraint, the ache and the ambition. The pieces of you most people flinch at, seen, acknowledged, and not just tolerated, but understood. When someone sees you for who you actually are, and not just the version you polish for the world, something deep inside exhales. The war quiets. The shoulders drop. You no longer feel the need to defend, to explain, to perform. You become dangerous in your ease, because you've realized the power of authenticity is not in being loved, it's in being free. You don't need to chase belonging, you carry it with you. You become the kind of person who no longer fears being misunderstood, because you stopped needing to be consumed by people who only feed on illusion. But the flip side, that's where it gets sinister. When someone sees through the persona you crafted with surgical precision, every false layer begins to sweat. The mask that once brought control becomes a cage, and the more someone sees, the less room you have to hide. Every smile you faked, every emotion you mimicked, every script you rehearsed, it all falls apart when someone refuses to play along. That's when fear creeps in. Not the kind that shrieks, but the kind that whispers, slow and venomous. They know. They know you're not what you pretend to be. They've studied your glitches, memorized your evasions, watched you reach for emotional cues that don't belong to you, and you feel it in your spine, that exposure, that hollow grip around your throat. Because now, you're not being adored. You're being observed, not loved, but dissected. That's the kind of seeing that shatters. You thought performance was protection, that if you could just act well enough, charming, thoughtful, wounded in just the right places, people would never dare to look deeper. You depended on applause to drown out suspicion, on sympathy to shield the empty space behind your theatrics. And for a while, it worked. Most people don't want truth. They want entertainment. So you played your part well, building a house of mirrors where your victims only saw reflections of themselves, until someone walked in who didn't look away, someone who didn't flinch at the shadows, someone who saw past the stage and into the scaffolding. You weren't ready for that. You weren't prepared for the person who didn't care about the script. You froze. Because suddenly, you were no longer in control of how you were perceived. You were no longer directing the narrative. You were exposed. And now every moment with them replays like a glitch in your memory. The times you smiled too wide. The times you said all the right things, but felt nothing. The moments they paused just long enough to see the disconnect between your words and your energy. You wonder what they saw, how much they pieced together, whether their silence meant compassion or quiet judgment. And it eats at you, not because they hurt you, but because they saw you, really saw you, and you know the difference. You know the difference between being adored for your illusion and being understood for your truth. You weren't understood. You were studied, and your entire defense collapsed under the weight of their awareness. That's the moment the fear started. The fear of being found out. The fear of facing the reality that you are not who you've been pretending to be. You still try to rewrite the story. Still try to bury the shame under logic. You convince yourself they misread you, that they projected, that they had their own issues. But the truth lingers like a slow poison. Because deep down, you remember the look in their eyes, the one that didn't need to raise a voice or accuse, the one that simply knew. And in that moment, all your practiced empathy, your emotional sleight of hand, your curated vulnerability, died. Not because it wasn't convincing, but because they no longer played their role in your theater. They sat down in the audience and stopped clapping. They stopped being seduced, and the silence left behind became your sentence. Now you relive it, not as an event, but as an echo, a haunting, the kind that makes you doubt if anyone ever really loved you, or if they only loved the fiction you fed them. You still smile, still charm, still keep up appearances. But now there's a crack in the glass. Now you feel watched, even in your solitude. Not because they're still around, but because the version of you they exposed cannot be unseen. Every compliment you receive feels undeserved. Every new connection feels temporary. Because you know, at any moment, someone might see it again. See you again. Not the persona, not the brand, but the emptiness, the manipulation, the fear, and you work hard to patch it up, to rehearse better, to polish the next act. But there's always a voice whispering underneath. What if they see it too? That's not paranoia. That's residue. That's what exposure does. It doesn't just hurt. It changes you. You thought being invisible was the worst feeling in the world. Now you know better. Now you know that being seen, truly seen, for the thing you never wanted to confront, is far more devastating. It doesn't just strip you bare. It leaves you unarmed in a battlefield of your own making. Because now, every lie has weight. Every performance feels brittle. You used to wear your mask with pride. Now you wear it with fear. And every time someone gets close, you brace for impact. Not because you fear rejection, but because you fear recognition. You fear that someone else might see what that one person saw, that someone else might unmask you without lifting a finger, and you fear that next time, you won't even have the strength to pretend. The irony is that you always wanted to be known. That was the wound, wasn't it? That no one understood you, that no one took the time. So you built a version of yourself you thought they could love, and they did. But it wasn't you they loved, it was the mask. And when someone finally came along who looked beneath it, you panicked. Because deep down, you didn't want to be known. You wanted to be worshipped. And truth kills worship. Truth levels the ground. And on that ground, you had nothing to stand on. So you ran. Or they left. Either way, the story ended. But it left behind the echo of the gaze, the one that saw it all. And now, you're not haunted by them. You're haunted by the version of you they revealed. People don't fear exposure. They fear your refusal to stay blind. They never feared being exposed. They feared being seen by you once you stopped worshiping their disguise. Because when you were blind, they held all the power. They fed you just enough honesty to appear real, just enough pain to appear human. They orchestrated your perception, dressed themselves in fragments of truth, so their lies would blend in like shadows. You weren't naive. You were loyal. And loyalty has a cost when given to the undeserving. But one day, something shifted. You stopped taking their words at face value. You stopped rationalizing red flags as misunderstandings. You stopped choosing love over logic. And that's when the fear began. Not yours, but theirs. You opened your eyes, and they felt it like a knife. Not because you called them out, but because you no longer bowed. Your silence became unsettling. They noticed how your questions sharpened, how your responses grew shorter. You were no longer impressed by the gestures that once melted your spine, no longer seduced by dramatics, no longer comforted by confessions designed to reset the game. And when they realized they could no longer control what you saw, they unraveled. Because your vision wasn't something they could edit. You had seen the script too many times. You knew the pauses before the lie. You recognized the way their voice shifted when they performed empathy. And when they caught you watching, really watching, they panicked. Not because they thought you'd attack, but because they knew you wouldn't pretend anymore. That's what they feared most, that you would no longer participate in the illusion. They crafted their identity on the assumption that you'd stay blind forever, that you'd keep offering the benefit of the doubt long after it was deserved. And for a time, you did. You gave them grace no one else would. You forgave things they weren't even sorry for. You spun narratives to protect their image, both for them and for yourself. Because it was easier to believe in a lie you loved than to confront a truth that would ruin everything. But once you saw, you couldn't unsee. And the more you saw, the more they sensed the foundation crumbling beneath their feet. They didn't fear being caught. They feared being understood. Because understanding doesn't lead to arguments. It leads to exit. And they weren't ready to lose the audience they built their illusion for. You weren't cruel. You were clear. And clarity, when offered without emotion, terrifies manipulators. Because now they can't claim victimhood. They can't twist your truth into rage. They can't paint your withdrawal as betrayal. You didn't slam doors. You didn't shout accusations. You simply stopped looking at them through the fog. And in doing so, you took back every ounce of power they siphoned from your loyalty. They'll call it abandonment. They'll call it coldness. But beneath the words is panic. Because if you won't play along, the illusion dies. The false self they curated becomes transparent. And what's left beneath that mask is something even they can't look at for too long. You didn't steal their dignity. You revealed the vacancy behind it. You didn't weaponize the truth. You just stopped shielding them from it. And suddenly, every room you entered felt like interrogation. You didn't say anything, but your presence made them squirm, because it reminded them of what they once hid behind your affection. You weren't the threat. They were their own undoing. But you became the mirror, the one they could no longer control, the one that didn't bend to their angles or blur the reflection. That's why they fear you now. Not for what you'll say, but for what you already know. They don't worry about exposure to the world. They worry about being irrelevant in your eyes. That's the death they can't recover from. Because when you see them for what they are, and still choose to walk away without dragging their name, it rewrites the story. You become the narrator. They lose the script. And in the void where their manipulation used to thrive, now lives consequence. Quiet, brutal, and permanent. No chance for spin. No stage for re-entry. Just the reality that they are no longer protected by your blindness. They will try to reclaim the narrative, to convince others that you were unstable, emotional, reactive. But the people who knew you before the awakening will sense it. They'll feel the shift. And one by one, they'll start seeing the same cracks. Because when one person sees clearly, it's contagious. You were never their enemy. You were their reflection. And once that reflection stopped showing admiration and started showing indifference, they panicked. Not because they lost your attention, but because they lost the mask. They counted on you to stay soft, to stay questioning, to stay in love with potential. But you didn't just stop loving them. You outgrew the fantasy. You grew past the need to believe they were better than they acted. And that's a threat to anyone who depends on illusion. Your clarity becomes a virus in their narrative. Every lie they tell now carries the risk of being traced back to your silence, because the one who refuses to stay blind is the one who quietly destroys the lie without ever lifting a blade. They keep looking over their shoulder, not because you're chasing them, but because you're not. That's the fear now, that you walked away, eyes wide open, and still chose to say nothing. Because silence from someone who sees everything feels like thunder. It presses on their conscience. It rattles the cage they built out of pretense. They would rather be hated than forgotten, rather be exposed than ignored. Because at least then, they matter. But you gave them the worst fate of all. You saw through them, and you walked away without flinching, without applause, without the need for validation. And that's what haunts them, that you left, and they still don't know how much you knew. Now their peace is measured in the distance between your truth and their reputation. Every day that passes without your retaliation feels like a countdown. They know what they did, they know what they were, and they know that you see it, all of it. You became untouchable, not through vengeance, but through vision. They cannot reach you. They cannot discredit what you never gave voice to. Your power isn't in what you expose, it's in what you let them live with. Because sometimes, the worst punishment isn't justice. It's letting the guilty rot in the silence of their own unmasked reflection. And the ones who once needed you blind now fear that you never closed your eyes again.